North Korean troops have reportedly vanished from battlefields in Kursk. Is it because they've finally taken too many casualties to sustain, or are they going back to the drawing board? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to talk about that, plus Israel's incursion into the West Bank, the Russian commander-in-chief heading to Pokrovsk, and Putin and Xi having a sit-down talking about collaboration, coordination, and World War III. Let's get right into it. Okay. There's a ton of crazy stories today, obviously. Do me a favor, guys, if you appreciate these daily updates on kind of the whole national security space, hit that subscribe button. That makes a huge difference for me. It tells the YouTube algorithm that I'm one of the real voices putting out real information. So I thought this was a really interesting story here. North Korean soldiers reportedly have basically vanished from the battlefield, that they abruptly went from being sort of everywhere in certain directions in Kursk, particularly the northwest, but that suddenly they appear to have vanished, right? And Washington Post quoted one Ukrainian soldier who speculated that the North Koreans are licking their wounds, right? This would be, he was referring to regrouping and rearming and possibly consolidating following some pretty significant losses. But the North Koreans, as the Ukrainians point out, and as we've pointed out on this channel, the North Koreans had very little relevant tactics, right? They seem to be using Soviet-style assault tactics, which resulted in very, very high casualties, even relative to Russian tactics, which themselves are quite high casualties. But they described evolving North Korean troops, right? That those who showed up in subsequent battles appeared to be more tactically sound for the modern battlefield, and were able to take their skills like physical fitness, high motivation, and excellent small arms proficiency, and actually adapt them to this modern war. Right? North Koreans learning from their mistakes, which then raises some interesting questions. If the North Koreans were already evolving their tactics, why then would they have to pull off the battlefield just as their tactics were starting to consolidate, right? Well, Zelensky has alleged that North Korean losses is around 4,000 troops. And losses, again, could be, it likely includes both KIA and wounded. And some of those wounded probably can be returned to duty relatively quickly. But relatively quickly can still mean weeks. And so what I actually think is happening is a little bit of both of sort of your theories put together, that it's both consolidation, right? For example, if you have, let's say of those 4,000, let's say 2,000 are either KIA or wounded so severely that they can't be returned to duty. Well, you're going to have, if you have a 10,000 man contingent and you're down 20% of them, remember, it's not, militaries are meant to be able to sustain a certain level of losses in almost any specialty, but there is a point at which you have to engage in some kind of consolidation. For example, let's say one unit has lost all of their medics, another unit has lost 2/3 of their infantry, but none of their medics. Well, logically, you're going to have to start to do what's called cross-leveling. You're going to take specialists from one area and put them in another, right? Apply medic to anti-tank gunner or RPG operator or whatever. You also, at the same time, are going to want to consolidate and have these units engage in some level of joint training. So, right? So to sit there and go, oh, okay, in my squad, we did things this way. In your squad, we do things this other way. And that's not as much of a problem in Soviet doctrine, right? NATO and the US specifically, we have very unit-specific TTPs. And the Ukrainians are even more like that. The Ukrainian units are almost little mini armies unto themselves with their own sort of tactical protocols, their own SOPs. And so the North Koreans are likely going to have to do a little bit of this cross-leveling, a little bit of this rebuilding command. Again, remember, all casualties are not equal, right? One unit may have lost 2 tiers of leadership, their platoon and company commander. Another unit may be depleted but have their command staff intact. but you're also going to have cross training, right? So these guys are going to say, hey, what's worked? What doesn't? What do the Russians do that we want to integrate? What do the Russians do that we think is a little crazy? They're going to reevaluate their tactical choices. They're going to reevaluate some of their tactics. Again, for example, I think their bait and attack drone tactic is likely going to go the way of the it's going to be cast aside. I think you're going to see the 3 to 4 man assault group really get used. I think you're also going to see the North Koreans change their equipment mix. So they may sit there and say, hey, we actually want to have a couple of our own FPV drone pilots that can provide this direct support, right? Because remember, if the North Koreans are conducting the assault and speak Korean, and you have Russian drone pilots in a support role, well, how does that North Korean commander go, hey, I need you to attack this position here, 300 meters to my north, right? How can you translate that? Particularly if you're going from North Korean military radio protocols to Russian military radio protocols. It's not just as easy as plugging things into Google Translate. But even more significantly, you also, I think, are going to see the North Koreans change their mix in terms of weapon systems. You're going to see different units say, hey, anti-tank weapons, these anti-tank teams, not even worth taking into battle. Just get rid of them. Give them instead, make them automatic riflemen, for example, right? Give them machine guns. Or say, you anti-tank teams, you're out. We're going to train you up on FPV drones. And generally that training takes around a month. So I suspect you're going to see probably 6 weeks maybe in which North Korean troops are going to consolidate their formations. They are going to change their mix of weapon systems. They're going to, again, ditch the ones that don't really have combat relevance. They're going to add in, again, I really think they're going to add in their own FPV drone teams, or FPV or reconnaissance. I think reconnaissance may be their number one priority, given that, again, FPVs sometimes appear to have like kind of a preparatory function, right? So they'll hit them with FPVs or cleanup function. So before and after assaults, but not during assaults. That though is reconnaissance drones. Plus, in reconnaissance drones, you really want that operator to be able to see something, get right on the radio and say, hey, squad leader or whatever. Squad leader, you are going to see 200 meters to your north is an entrenched enemy position, right? And so I think that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing a refit. You may also see, I'd be curious, this is the thing that I'm most intrigued about. You may also see another round of fresh North Korean recruits get sent in to plus up those numbers. But again, that is something that I would be much more curious about. And I think that may be a little premature. I think the North Koreans likely will go through one iteration of this consolidate, fix, and try again. And they may go through one more consolidate, fix, and try again. And then what the North Koreans will likely do, or I suspect they're going to do, is say, okay, great. These guys that have gone through this experience, some of you are going to stay in camps in Russia, and you're going to train another iteration, another 10,000 North Korean troops, right? And you're going to develop this sort of training curriculum that's going to then send those troops into combat more ready and more prepared. Again, given that a lot of the captured North Koreans have said that the Russians didn't tell us anything, likely because even if the Russians did want to, they probably wouldn't have the translators sophisticated enough and committed enough to actually conduct a long training interval for tens of thousands of troops, right? That would require dozens of translators at least. So I think some of them are going to go there, and some of these experienced troops will be sent into North Korea, where they'll begin to sort of help develop new doctrines for the North Korean military itself. Likely that contingent will probably be more like officer corps and senior soldiers, but they are going to, again, put out this doctrinal information. They're going to bring modern battlefield realities to the North Korean army, where it'll start to percolate through. And so eventually you'll have a military, again, that looks a little bit like when the U.S. military, right when I deployed in 2009, you had a lot of the lessons that were learned in 2005, 6, and 7 were being integrated into the force. So my basic training had a bunch of elements to it, react to convoy ambush, for example, clearing an IED, that were reflections of the current warfighting environment, right? That had come back around. So that meant that I had a basic orientation of my basic training. My officer training involved a lot of counterinsurgency, a lot of raids, a lot of key leader engagements. And then when I had 3 months of pre-deployment training, right, targeted to the specific task my unit would be doing on deployment. And then finally, you had the actual deployment. So by the time I got to the deployment, there was a lot of instances in which the battlefield reality had percolated into the training pipeline. And that's what you're going to see in the North Koreans as well. So now I want to mention that the Russians, there's always a little bit of speculation of where's Russia's focus at any given time, right? But it's very clear at this point that Pokrovsk is the focus. Why? Because the Russian chief of their armed forces, their equivalent to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Gerasimov, actually visited troops near Pokrovsk. He got within about 20 miles of Pokrovsk itself. And I'm going to pat myself on the back and say that, your favorite influencer got just quite a bit closer than old Gerasimov. Right? So again, when you look at Pokrovsk, within 20 miles, credit where credit's due, 20 miles is going to be about right here. So not exactly far away, right? Near the Umansky area, maybe as close as Kalinova. But I think the important takeaway here is that it's a sign that Gerasimov is not just visiting here because it's a priority, but that he actually shot a bunch of content in there. And this is important because this was, you might remember, one of the things that made Prigozhin such a popular figure in Wagner is because Prigozhin would throw on a plate carrier and a helmet and he would go to the front lines, right? He famously would tour the mines of Soledar, filming content sometimes just hours after Wagner Group had taken that area. And it was seen by these troops as a tremendously a reflection of the fact that the head of Wagner and the lowest of the low troopers were willing to assume the same risk, right? Here is Soledar, right? So the mines, which were actually a store of weapons. Let's see if we can get this here. There we go, right? So even if the mines were literally as little as 8 kilometers from the front lines, and I think that is really significant, and it was a really big sort of, what's the word I want? I don't want to say a political coup, but it was a public relations coup. It really cemented Wagner or Prigozhin as a of the troops kind of leader. And Gerasimov really, and other Russian generals really need to co-opt that, essentially. And so that's why, of course, he dropped in with a helicopter with a big Z symbol. He chose military vehicles on a busy road near the village of Karlivka. Right? Gerasimov gives medals to soldiers, receives reports from commanders, and says some nice words about the troops. So, again, an interesting kind of, I think, reflection of the efforts by the Russian military to show that their generals and the troops doing the fighting are not as far apart. But we know the reality that even if you get that close, right? And again, he doesn't appear to have ever gotten really significantly close to the front lines. But again, the Ukrainians would absolutely have hit the dude to the HIMARS if they had known. But that he likely is going to they're trying to just convince the Russians that these casualties, these massive losses that they're taking, are something that the state itself and the folks in the Kremlin they're suffering too. Now, before we talk about Putin and Xi Jinping having a sit down talking about World War III, I wanted to mention that I got a text yesterday, actually, from one of the units, I can't specify which one, that we helped in my visit to Ukraine. And we were like, hey, listen, our fundraiser has been very successful. I'm actually going to put the link in the description. So if you guys, because it's still going on, our fundraiser for you guys has been really successful. What do you want? What are your most pressing needs right now? And they said, guys, we want a Mavic 3T, the latest and greatest with the thermal camera. We really want to be able to do these reconnaissance missions at night, and more of the gum. So there you go. The choice of Ukrainian drone pilots is clear. It's strike gum, which makes sense, right? You're wearing FPV goggles, right? You just want to be able to chew your gum and stay focused on those long missions. But it doesn't have to be if you're a drone pilot or a soldier, right? Strike gum's for anybody that drinks an energy drink and is like, dude, these are expensive. They taste like cough medicine and they are loaded with sugar. Strike gum solves all those problems. 90 milligrams of caffeine in each individual piece. So this pack contains 5 energy drinks worth of caffeine, but no sugar. Instead, we got 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, plus it's a refreshing mint flavor. And it's made in the USA and veteran owned. So, dude, it's a no-brainer, right? Combat tested, veteran owned, made in the USA. What else? And here's the thing. I'll add one other thing. If you are a member of the United States military and you are deployed and you are willing to snap a picture, doesn't have to be like, don't violate OPSEC, but a cool deployed picture of you chewing strike gum, we'll send you a pack. Just let me know. Hit up the email, dan@combatvetnews.com, or I think it's also dan@strikegum, and we'll get you guys a pack. It's got to be an APO address, right? I want to see strike gum my goal would be to get strike gum in every conflict zone, fueling troops across the world. I think that'd be pretty badass. Okay, so Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, having a sit down. The timing is not an accident, guys, because both of these individuals are prime targets of Donald Trump, right? He is very explicit that they loom large in his foreign policy vision, for good and ill. And it makes sense then that they want to signal to him, to the U.S. administration, that they are coordinating and collaborating in ways that their goal is to make the United States sweat. Now, this is the official Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so this contains a lot of fluff, right? You can see the official screenshots here. Note that both countries have their flags actually displayed with equal prominence in their backgrounds. Really, these things aren't accidents, okay? You can also see that of course, there's a lot of fluff, right? Putin wishing Xi a good Chinese Spring Festival and a good New Year, right? Of course, they acknowledged that the 75th anniversary of their diplomatic ties, their coordination in the culture and military, and the history of both countries fighting in the war against fascism. I think the Russians call it the Great Patriotic War, and the Chinese call it the World Anti-Fascist War. And so they note that they always trust each other. But there's actual stuff being discussed here, right? And one of the largest topics that has actually come up is, you guessed it, Ukraine and Taiwan, baby. In fact, even the Chinese MOD acknowledges that the Taiwan independence is a non-starter, right? Of course, they mentioned that I'd say that there is. That they discussed the situations in the Middle East where Russia's ally Assad has been sort of booted out of Syria, South Korea, and Taiwan, right? There's also a sort of vague statement about Xi being willing to work with Putin in response to, quote, external uncertainties, without mentioning specifics, right? Now, remember, last week, before he even took office, Xi held a phone call with Trump, and the U.S. president described it as a very good discussion for both countries, talking about trade, fentanyl, and TikTok, right? Putin, of course, is one of the first phone calls that Trump wants to make. And again, I am somebody who has been extremely critical. I have criticisms of everyone who sat in the White House. I've had criticisms of the previous administration, and I have criticisms of this one, right? Literally, before he even took office, he launched a scam coin, and you know what I think about that. But credit where credit's due. If you are a major power player in the world, right, which, like it or not, Russia and China both are, you want to have frequent open dialogue with them, right? And a lot of times countries will sit there and they'll do this stage managed thing where they go, it's like dating in middle school. Well, the optics are bad if I call you, but the optics are good if you call me, because then it looks like you're coming to me, whereas I need to come to you. And well, whose flags are going to be in this order? But they literally, it's like the international collaboration or coordination or visits can sometimes feel like the most anxious middle schooler getting ready for a date. Right? Well, what if I put on this outfit? Well, what if I wear this? Well, what if she says that? Well, what if she brings one of her friends? Well, what if I see somebody I know? What if my mom, will it be okay? Can my mom drop me off at the mall? What if she drops me off around the corner and I just walk around the corner so they don't see that I have a mom? Right? And you just want to tell that middle schooler, chill out, dude. Just chill out. Well, sometimes you want to tell these guys, listen, just pick up the phone. You don't have to solve all your problems. Just countries talk to each other. Just talk. Right? So again, credit where credit's due. I'm glad to see that level of coordination happening. Do I want them to make major agreements like over the phone? No. But, open lines of communication, reduce the likelihood of miscoordination and, potential real international disasters. All right. Let's talk about another topic. We actually have, two other topics. One is the Israel invasion or whatever into the West Bank. And this, I think, is not actually that important a story, but what is important is I think this is a good illustration of kind of the news spin machine. And what bothers me so much about modern media, mainstream media, is that they love deleting context, right? And here's the thing. So CNN, God, I can't stand them. I at this point am just tickled pink to see them going bankrupt because I think they deserve it, right? They abandoned, I think, a lot of their journalistic standards in exchange for becoming a hyper-partisan news outlet. And I want, I want that. What I want is them to return to journalistic standards. But failing that, if they go under, maybe other news outlets will. But here's an example. Israel launches a large-scale West Bank raid as minister calls for Gaza-style operation. Now, look at this. One, they describe it as large-scale, and then a minister calling for a Gaza-style operation, which is a pretty vague statement. Now, it says Israel's military carried out raids. Now it's plural, right? You're either doing one raid or multiple raids. They're not the same thing. A raid is a specific military action, right? And you're either doing one or multiple, right? Raids and airstrikes in multiple parts of the occupied West Bank early Wednesday, killing 11 Palestinians in an offensive Israel says is its most expansive in years. IDF said it launched a large counter-terror operation overnight with the Israeli Security Agency in Jenin and Tul Karim in the north of the West Bank, right? They describe it as CNN calls it a significant combined Israeli operation involving drones, bulldozers, military and security forces, and 4 battalions of Israeli border police and a unit of undercover troops. So, right? Of course, the Israeli foreign minister said it was to thwart an Islamic Iranian terror infrastructure and that was working to establish an Eastern Front against Israel. Right? This is a war for all intents and purposes, he said. We want to win it. And he added, we must deal with the threat just as we deal with the terrorist infrastructure in Gaza, including the temporary evacuation of Palestinian residents wherever steps are required. This is, again, a long way from saying this needs to be a Gaza-style operation, right? And this is what I think is important, is that this thing got a lot of print and it gets a lot of hand-wringing from the sort of mainstream media. But what's interesting is, and you can see Al Jazeera is even more brazen, leading with the number of people killed, describing it as a major raid. Again, the operation, though, this is what I want you to take away. Al Jazeera, who's going to make the Israelis seem as dangerous and militant as possible, described the operation as involving hundreds of ground soldiers, right? Now, if it was over 500, they'd probably say things like nearly 1,000. So I'm going to say that this is on the high end 500, right? 500 troops. And again, they say the largest assault in 2 decades. But what I think is important is that a lot of people are comparing this to the Gaza operation. They're like, it's Gaza part 2, right? And especially, I think American left-wing media outlets want users to believe that now that Trump is in office, the world is aflame in conflict, and that only the White House could contain, was working tirelessly to contain the conflict. But let's put things in context. 500, we'll round it down to 400 for easy math. 400 troops are in this raid. The Israeli incursion into Gaza was 40,000, okay? So it was literally nearly 10 times larger. No, excuse me, 100 times larger. So this raid is 1% of the Gaza operation in terms of scale and personnel. And this is important because did you feel those articles were written to capture the fact that it represents 1% of the scale of the Israeli ground operation in Gaza? No, it wasn't. It was written with hyperbole. It was written because the same way that right-wing media outlets exacerbate all other events, all negative events when a left of center American president is in the White House. Every single thing is a total fucking disaster, right? The way it gets covered in right-wing media outlets, you would think the U.S. spent every dime it has on the Ukrainians. But in fact, we actually are at multi-decade lows in terms of our spending on military and defense as a percentage of GDP. And now that there's another different party in the White House, you're going to start to see the same things. And the scary thing is that it becomes really hard to tease out what's a real policy failure by the White House and what is just media hyperbole, right? Turning a nothing burger into a total fucking disaster. And that, I think, is one of the most difficult things to discern. And that's literally the reason this channel exists, to give you guys real information to place things in context as best we can, right? Now, there's one final story that I thought was really important. And again, this is a classic example of there was a nothing burger story that gets big headlines. Here's a story that I think is way more important, but isn't getting the same coverage. And this is something that has been going on for at least 6 months, right? But there's been a Forbes article here recently sort of rolling out basically cope. And this is that Silicon Valley has become really nervous about Chinese nationals working for their companies. They say leading U.S. technology companies are increasing their security screenings of employees and job applicants, which they say is necessary to counter the espionage threat from China. Right? Now, legally, they cannot just screen out Chinese nationals, but they are looking very carefully at, well, Chinese nationals, right, is the intent. And this is because they describe it, thought to be particularly vulnerable to pressure from the Beijing government. Right? So, and you see some of this, right? They describe a Chinese computer science graduate student at a U.S. university who's studying cybersecurity in hopes of improving his job prospects in the United States, right? But they, of course, are like, won't someone think of the poor Chinese nationals studying in the United States? But here's the thing. Let's see if we can find it here. The Chinese spying on American technology is extremely commonplace, right? And I think one of the things to take away here is that, for example, one of Google's most powerful AI chips that they designed in-house was actually stolen recently by a Chinese employee and turned over to the Chinese government, right? And the U.S. government, of course, is trying to do its part, trying to step up security measures, particularly in regards to exporting advanced computing chips and artificial intelligence, right? Because the power of AI to build weapon systems is absolutely unreal. And China unlike the United States, has zero qualms about building the most lethal weapon systems possible with AI, right? But also companies themselves have an incentive. Now, again, the article that sort of got me going was this Business Insider article. I'll show you guys the headline, but it was calling this fear a red scare. They call it Silicon Valley's new red scare. Yeah, it's paywall, the classic, right, from Business Insider. And they call it, Chinese, poor. Won't someone think of the poor Chinese nationals, right? Here's the thing. Again, radical though it is, I'm going to go ahead and say that American companies should focus on employing American workers, right? And not for the feel-good bullshit reasons, right? But because literally the Chinese nationals, right? This is not ethnically Chinese Americans. Totally different, right? Totally distinct. Chinese Americans, born here, raised here, U.S. citizens, passport holders, loyal to the country. This is not a statement about them. This is a statement about individuals that hold Chinese passports, Chinese citizens, Chinese passport holders that come to the United States exclusively to work and study. And what they are subject to is the National Intelligence Law of the People's Republic of China, passed in May. The final version passed in May of 2017. There are some controversial provisions here that are not that controversial, and that is namely Article 7, right? Now, Article 7 of this law states all organizations and citizens shall support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence efforts in accordance with this law, and shall protect national intelligence work secrets that they are aware of, right? Article 10 says, as necessary for their work, national intelligence work institutions, this is their CIA and FBI, are to use necessary means, tactics, and channels to carry out intelligence efforts domestically and abroad. And Article 18, as required for work and in accordance with relevant national provisions, national intelligence work institutions may ask organs such as customs or exit and entry border inspection to provide facilitations as exemptions from inspection. What does that mean? Well, look at Article 7 particularly. All organizations and citizens will cooperate with their CIA as they are ordered to. And that is a troubling thing, right? Imagine if there was a law that said, if the CIA orders you to do something, you must do it. Period. If you are going to travel to the Middle East, right, you will collect intelligence. You will visit this Middle Eastern military base, right? Oh, you want to go to Saudi Arabia? You will ask about these three things when you go to the Saudi university. Imagine if the U.S. did that as a matter of policy with every single person. What would that mean? Well, almost every other country would basically ban all U.S. professional cooperation. Why? Because they're all spies. It makes everyone a spy. And insanely, preposterously, ridiculously, in the United States, we just don't. We're just like, yeah, hire those Chinese. What's the worst that can happen? Well, the answer is the worst that can happen is literally the largest transfer of wealth in human history. This is according to FBI Director Christopher Wray, describing Chinese economic espionage, right? This is to the tune. This is Chinese companies. Because remember, in the United States, we say private industry and government are two separate entities. The government wants to secure the country from threats. Private industry wants to become more competitive, deliver at the same or better service at a lower price. We look at them as totally separate. The Chinese do not. The Chinese government says, listen, our country's economic success, the success of our companies in business is the same thing as the success of our state. And the U.S. government kind of recognizes this too, right? That's why, of course, the U.S. government is happy to give Palantir a contract, a powerful AI company capable of developing systems for the most advanced weapon systems and intelligence gathering networks. So we recognize that it's kind of true too, but the Chinese take it to another level. And that's why they don't see a meaningful difference between stealing the designs for, say, an F-35 fighter jet, which is currently the Chinese J-35, and stealing the design of, for example, an advanced Google AI chip so that the Chinese can copy it, manufacture their own at a fraction of the price. And this industrial espionage has likely, it's believed, cost the U.S. about $225 to $60 billion a year. 1 in 5 corporations, this is according to a CNBC survey, not even a national intelligence, right? This isn't like the FBI being like 1 in 5 corporations say China's stolen their IP. Give us more money. This is CNBC, who has no dog in the fight. 1 in 5 corporations will admit that China has stolen intellectual property within the last 12 months. And 1 in 3 said it's happened sometime in the last 100 years, right? And so this sort of thing, right? And remember, the Chinese hacked into U.S. telecom agencies. They are in U.S. telecom agencies, present tense. They hacked into the Equifax data. They have gotten so much stuff. Just Google Salt Typhoon. So the reason I thought this is really relevant is this is one of the largest scale espionages in human history. And remember, it's sort of preposterous to be like, hey, Americans build these things. They discover these things. They discover new and better chips. They built the quantum computer in the United States. And then the Chinese just steal it. And it's like, this is the kind of thing where there's like immigration boogeymen and there's real threats. This is a real threat. The fact that every Chinese national you bring into the country must become a spy from the Chinese intelligence as soon as the Chinese intelligence agency wants it. So how can you ever let them near any sort of sensitive proprietary technology? You shouldn't. You can't. You couldn't. Because if you did, as soon as they got access to it, that's when the Chinese CIA goes knocking on their door. Says, hey, we have to have a chat about, we know that you have access to Google's new AI system. We know that you have access to Google's quantum computer. We need you to get the designs for us, right? Remember, we've talked about this in other videos. The Chinese, remember, the first drone flights over sensitive U.S. military installations were perpetrated by Chinese graduate students purchasing hobbyist drones who flew over Hunter Ingalls shipyard. And then they were immediately caught and deported back to China. But guess what? Their visa was expiring anyway. So they faced no punishment for recording HD footage of sensitive U.S. shipyards, sending it directly to the CCP. And then their only punishment was going back to China with a U.S. education and a U.S. degree. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff that I'm trying to get people to give a shit about and not give a shit about whatever dumb fucking thing, is making the headlines today. Right. Anyway, that's all I had. Thank you to Bill Collier, Robert Coburn, Gars Martin, Eugenia Questa, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Karis, L90, Pecha Taru, all of the Colonel tier members, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I hope you guys enjoyed the exclusive video that we got from the Liute Brigade yesterday. That was a crazy combined arms attack. If you're interested, of course, combatvetnews.com. Link is in the description. See you in the next one. Cheers.